All right, welcome everyone. I'm back again to moderate the second panel here to provide a slightly deeper dive from a technical standpoint on this concept of audience cohort creation that we chatted a little bit about superficially in the intro framing session right before this. But we've got a group of folks on this panel: Abhishek Sen, who's the CEO and co-founder of Number 8, Garrett McGrath, VP of Product Management at Magnite, and Ellie Marshall, Head of Data at DAX Worldwide and Global, to talk a little bit more about how we see the audience cohort concept as a form of addressability kind of evolving to support privacy-centric approaches kind of across the board. What we've heard about audience cohort creation to date has largely sat inside this privacy sandbox conversation. Obviously the privacy sandbox is, and the kind of Chrome proposals that sit within it are specific to browser-based addressability to make sure that personal data doesn't actually leave the browser itself, right? And thus is much more privacy-centric. And the development of an audience is anonymized, basically. You can still provide an audience signal, but in a way that's much more privacy-centric. And so we think it's important to think about this concept, not only within the context of privacy sandbox, but also other kind of novel approaches that we've been hearing about really over the last year and a half, but largely accelerated by the recent kind of shakeup within the ID space and the legislative environment and the browser environment. A lot of the thinking around how audience cohorts can be accomplished and used to support addressability scenarios that don't rely on that browser dependency. And so we've got a number of folks in Abhishek and Garrett and Ellie who have been thinking deeply about this. Ellie largely as an integrator and a user of these types of approaches. So Abhishek, you guys at Number 8 have been thinking about this for quite a while. Before we get into kind of how you guys, from a technical standpoint, talk about audience cohorts and some of the use cases it supports, can you just describe or define for us really quick what is an audience cohort and why it's seemingly more privacy safe than relying on browser or device IDs?
Sure. Yeah, thanks a lot, Ben. And yeah, it's glad to be back at IAB Tech Lab, because when we presented last year, it was around September. We were all in person, so this is great to be everything remotely done. So it's very interesting. For us, it was first, being able to package individual contextual signals that we have from mobile sensors. We're speaking from mobile perspective over here, not from a browser perspective. To be able to package individual signals that can range from anything like location, IP address, accelerometers, barometers, everything that's present on our smartphones, to be able to intelligently then package it into something that a media buyer would actually understand. Now, an audience cohort is, in a very basic manner, it's the group of users that are sharing a set of attributes. And that can be based on usage patterns, behaviors, interests, context, etc. Now, as you know, traditionally, audiences have been built based on, okay, you basically have an ID information that's associated to, let's say, Ben, Ellie, Garrett, and these IDs will be associated to a certain Venn diagram or blob. And that will be stored in specific data warehouses, or it's going to be stored in sort of third-party data sources. And that's how the bids, anything gets enriched. As we're seeing the landscape changing, now with the lack of IDs being there, how are you even going to do audience generation? How is that going to happen? At least from a mobile perspective, because there's no ID information going out, so how is this going to happen? And that's where I see an audience cohort really becoming very valuable, from the point of how can we dissociate the concept of ID, but still give advertisers and brands value by being able to target groups of users or cohorts to generate ROI while preserving consumer privacy at all costs. So that's what I would say what an audience cohort is in our definition.
Awesome, thank you so much. Yeah, important, I think, just to level set on some of the definitional aspects of this. Audience cohort, we're seeing is becoming a bit commoditized in the trade press. And it's talking about many different kind of technical solutions the same way. So I think just kind of normalizing is going to be important as we have this conversation. I'm actually going to skip ahead. I have your slides up about your specific approach to audience cohort creation. Maybe we talk through those really quickly, just as an example of a different way of thinking about this outside of the browser dependency. And
Sure.
then I'd love to introduce and get Garrett up here to talk through some of the Magnite proposals that his team has been thinking about.
Sure. So what I'll just briefly talk through the slide if you don't mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Let's.
Okay, cool. So we have the slide now. It's just a very generic slide in terms of saying, consumers today view in a mobile environment, they use a lot of applications. So, and in these devices, from day one, if you think of a mobile environment, there have been sensors in them for a long time. What is the whole point of a sensor? A sensor senses an ambient environment. And what we do is essentially taking things like accelerometers, location, compass, brightness, all these things that are natively available on the device, combine them intelligence around device AI. And what does that mean? Okay, all our machine learning software runs on the device. It gets packaged into a software development kit. And then we basically plug in specific audience attributes. All right, so if I go running outside while listening to a music service every day at 7 o'clock in the morning, and that will classify me as a frequent jogger. That's an audience. That's just me, Abhishek, being classified as an audience. Now I can display it different. If I listen to music at, when I'm shopping or when I'm coming back home from work, these are all different moments. And that's where I can see an individual user's use of an application can define multiple audience attributes, which can in essence be then, from these individual signals, you can have specific attributes, audiences that are then translated over or sent over the bit stream. That's how we look at audiences from a contextual, as in a real world environment point of view.
Cool, that makes sense. Is this pretty self-explanatory? Is it worth kind of walking through the data flow here as well, based on your own kind of implementation within number 8?
It's been quite tricky actually to basically see where to place this, because we find it quite challenging. Where do you actually place this? Because everyone's, oh yeah, this is great. Contextual, like let's plug it anywhere you want. But then speaking the same language, it's like if I sell an apple, but then you want an apple pie, we have to speak the same language. So packaging these audience signals, so is a signal like commuting can be packaged into saying a green commuter. Then all of a sudden that becomes very interesting, because you might be cycling, I might take the tube, I might someone else might take the like an e-scooter or something. But can we then package these into audiences which are then sent in the bit stream itself without sending any ID information? And from a buying perspective, also what happens is that behavior doesn't change. You're buying an audience at the end of the day. I want to spend a specific budget amount, so whatever that amount is, I want to buy an audience of frequent shoppers without even having to worry about where is the data stored? Is there going to be a data leak? Is someone else going to snoop on this? Any kind of data liabilities that happen as soon as raw data leaves the device.
Yep.
So that's how we see it sort of flowing through.
And by extension, removing any kind of privacy concerns associated with that audience.
Any kind, exactly. And it was interesting to hear Graham from Facebook talk about this, where he said, you only use data where you can actually, that you can actually act on, not just data for the sake of data, because that's when you have a lot of issues. So why is this data being sent? So that's why, you have a data minimization where you say, all right, we'll send you the data that's actionable, that you can build your campaigns on, and then, we can hopefully keep publishers happy and then consumers happy as well, in the sense you're not actually disclosing anything that relates to Ben as an individual at this point.
Yeah, and presumably because this is all on device, provide some follow-up measurement and attribution options as well.
Absolutely.
Yep. Perfect. Thanks so much. Yeah, that's helpful. Garrett, I want to get you involved into the conversation here. I know that Magnite has been thinking about the concept of audience cohorts for a while now. You guys actually submitted some proposals within W3C in the form of Gatekeeper and proprietary cohorts. Would love to give you the floor really quickly, just to kind of walk through kind of the data flows and technical functioning of the proposals, just as another example to the way that cohorts could exist outside of the browser, as we've largely described them to date. We could start with Gatekeeper first, or proprietary cohorts, whatever you prefer.
Sure. Thanks for having us, or thanks for having me. Thanks to the Tech Lab. I might not answer your first question, instead talk a little bit about why we did this.
Yeah.
So if you're familiar with the Privacy Sandbox proposals that came from our friends at Google, at Chrome specifically, back in August, but then they became a big deal in January. the Flock, which is federated learning of cohorts, and Turtle Dove, which I won't even try to do that acronym, but it's retargeting. Those are the two biggest parts of their proposals, their list of proposals. And at the core of what they're saying is essentially the browser should be the only trusted entity for doing cohort creation or retargeting processes. And basically, I don't think Google would characterize it this way, but that basically they're the only ones who could be trusted to handle user data and do these things. So there's a lot of really good, interesting ideas that are, obviously do not rely on third-party cookies in those proposals. But Gatekeeper and proprietary cohorts they're ideas intended to illustrate how parts of those things perhaps could or should be done outside of the browser, and also to illustrate that doing things like holding an entire retargeting auction inside a browser might be difficult, to say the least. So Gatekeeper, aka, the reason why we said AKA, it's really just Flock with a server-side component. So federated learning of cohorts is the Google Chrome proposal for how to create cohorts, group users into cohorts within the browser so that only the browser is aware of them, and then make them available at runtime. A lot of the debate about those proposals and this proposal, and as recently as an hour ago, it's very much a lively debate still today, is whether or not there should be a server-side component, and if there should be a server-side component, who runs it, where does it run, is there one gatekeeper, are there 50, how are they governed, if part of these processes should happen outside the browser and necessarily or potentially necessarily have a server-side component, how would that work? So this slide and the next are just simple illustrations of a gatekeeper, meaning a server-side entity that has an ML component, which is the little circles in the bottom, developing flocks or developing cohorts of users in a privacy-centric way. So you notice that there's a user ID here in the request portion of that. It's an ID that is only known to the gatekeeper, and it's not persistent in the browser. And one of the most lively parts of the debate in the W3C discussions about these things is whether or not there really is an ID. At first, I think the message attempted to be, no, there's no ID. We're just doing all this ML magic in the browser. And eventually we got to a point of friendly admission that of course there's an ID, because how else you put a user in a bucket if you don't label them as such, but that ID is only known to the browser and doesn't go anywhere, which is the whole point of all this browser-centric stuff. You can go to the next slide if you want to.
Sure.
So ultimately what has happened in this proposal is we're proposing, and actually we're building a sandbox testing environment to try to test this out right now. But what we're proposing is that building cohorts should probably be done by some trusted entity. It needs governance, it needs all the things that should go along with that, but that building them and storing them uniquely in the browser is challenging, technically challenging. We're not sure browsers can really handle doing that. And also, more importantly, who are the trusted entities in our entire ecosystem who could be trusted to use or handle some level of user data without it going into unintended places or being fingerprinted or being stored on servers elsewhere. So Gatekeeper was written as an idea and a counter proposal for how to potentially move some of that stuff out of the browser or out of, honestly, only one entity in the entire world being able to do cohort creation, or at least in the entire Chrome world, being able to do cohort creation.
Yeah, thank you for that summary of the W3C conversations. Kind of preempted my next question here, but it actually brought up another interesting point. Another thing that was kind of discovered through conversation is that because it's tough to handle all of this decisioning inside the browser itself, the Chrome solution actually themselves do require server, right, in order to kind of on the use case. And so that opens the question, like, what is the role of competitive gatekeepers or cohort solutions, right, in this new space? If data is in fact leaving the browser and entering some kind of server, why can't it be other servers outside of the Chrome universe, right? And so I'm curious about your thoughts on like, competitive data cohort, audience cohort marketplace in the future, if that's a viable thing, given that, there's still a dependency in that scenario to interact with the browser, right? And Chrome still has the capability of being upstream of all of that, right? So curious about your thoughts on the likelihood of that.
Well, like I said, there's very lively debate going on about this, like literally today and for the last several months and going forward. I think Google started with the premise that it would all happen in the browser, but in the browser also does mean on their servers, but they are taking the job of being the trusted entity. And then that gave way to proposals like Gatekeeper, proposals like Sparrow, which comes from Criteo, which is a sort of an answer to TurtleDove and how retargeting might be done not entirely in the browser. And I think that a lot of people are concerned or nervous or some combination thereof of the Chrome becoming the center of the universe for audience creation, audience assignment, audience exposure, the whole retargeting process, which has given way to these proposals, Gatekeeper, proprietary cohorts. There are others. There are actually new ones today. So the issue is there's a lot of discussion about where to do these things. There's a lot of discussion about is there one trusted entity? Is there more than one trusted entity? And in which case, how many more? And how do you become one? And what are those criteria? And how is it all governed? And the best I can say is at the moment, this is all just ongoing discussion. I mean, like literally real time debate. We don't necessarily have to go too deeply into proprietary cohorts. The purpose of that proposal, which is out on GitHub, was to suggest a cohort creation process that was outside the browser, that wasn't necessarily server side or wasn't necessarily one particular entity. It could be anyone. And it would, the system would have to be agnostic to the IDs that it creates and have all of the privacy controls built into it. I think proprietary cohorts was really more presented as a way to have a conversation about the issues with these things, as opposed to something we thought would probably happen. That being said, I think there's a lot of discussion about gatekeepers going on, and I think that some version of that's very likely.
Yeah, cool. Thanks so much for that. Ellie, I want to get you involved here as well. Your voice, I think, is going to be important in this conversation because you're actually thinking about implementing something like this in the wild. You've been working with Abhishek and his team and placing some bets on the future of audience cohort creation and measurements for your business, which is a large, digital audio public operation in Europe. Curious about your thinking in terms of like, why you place those bets. Is it more of a reflection of how you see the privacy landscape evolving, or is there something more to it than just that? If it's purely an efficacy play and an efficiency play for your clients, or if it's largely a legislative consideration?
Sure, yeah, really interesting question. Thanks, Ben. So in terms of how our business actually operates, so DAX brings together audio inventory across online streaming, radio, and podcasting, basically synthesizes it into one single buying opportunity for advertisers. The way in which this is currently bought and sold is via connected audiences, via DMP, very ID level at the traditional audience sort of taxonomy, so demographics, life stage, purchase intent, etc. The main reasons in which we're looking to evolve this is to initially, to your point, around the changing privacy landscape. Basically, the way in which we technically operate and legally operate isn't going to be sustained. But also we're looking for actually just new and interesting ways to reach audiences as well. There's been quite a lot of saturation in the ways in which you can actually target digitally. So from a perspective from an advertiser offering something new and interesting and innovative is another reason for partnering with Number 8. The main ways in which we are looking to do it from a technical basis, basically to integrate the SDK into our apps, so we can capture listener signals as and when they're engaging with our brands. Abby went over a few of the different details, but there's so many things that we can actually understand based on this. So around like movements, around like locations, around device interactivity. And this helps us define a lot of different ways in which we can update our targeting decisioning. There are a number of different signals that can be captured, but actually when we think about taking this to advertisers, one of the main things is sort of bridging the gap between the very technical interface, but actually what's interesting for a media buy. And I think this is where it actually gets a bit more exciting in terms of how we can adapt it, not just from a privacy point of view, but actually from a positioning point of view as well. So moving away from sort of traditional targeting techniques to actually thinking more about sort of like moments and context. So is someone out for a run? Are they commuting? Are they stuck in traffic? What's the weather like? Then also secondly, using those contextual signals at a more habitual level to understand more about that consumer. So around their personalities, their characteristics. So are they socialites? Are they foodies? Are they night owls, et cetera, et cetera. So it does bring a few different benefits to us. One, as I said, is purely from the privacy landscape point of view, that it means that we're still respecting user privacy and adapting to the evolving landscape. But secondly, actually positioning it in a way that can fit on a media plan. So not just a like for like replacement, but still being able to offer new audiences and new ways of buying media, but still in kind of the same language that our clients expect. But I think thirdly, and I think what's most important from an audio point of view specifically, thinking about the channel, is actually moments and context are really interesting. And when you think about the different ways and different need states in which a listener consumes audio, it really evolves during the day. So looking at this type of solution, it's not simply a means to an end in order to remain privacy compliant, but actually really having a new targeting solution that fits really nicely with the actual media channel itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. Really interesting kind of very different technical approaches to kind of solving a similar problem. And it seems like, there's creative applications that can be used kind of across the board, right? That you guys are seeing within your own business. And I think this will be a pretty hot space to pay attention to as we start putting together kind of that catch-all bucket of addressability kind of solutions that we want to support as, within Rearc and within Tech Lab more broadly. I think that's a good way to kind of underscore the flexibility that these types of approaches could have for different types of businesses. So thank you for that. That's super helpful. I wanted to kind of open it up to kind of the group here real quick. We've got maybe 2 or 3 minutes before we open it up to questions from the audience, but curious about the extent to which we at Tech Lab can help in this process. Obviously, Abhishek, we've talked a bit about the potential use of a standardized content taxonomy that we have within Tech Lab. There's also this audience taxonomy that actually is a standardized way of describing audience and potentially a standardized way of communicating that signal. Do you guys see these as viable ways of helping to facilitate and scale these types of approaches if we do end up getting to a competitive marketplace? Maybe I'll start with Abhishek and then Garrett and Ellie hop in after.
Sure. Okay. So my co-founder, he was actually involved in the OpenRTB working group at Tech Lab, and the discussion was around SK Ad Network and how some of these new contextual signals can become part of OpenRTB. So I think there's 2 things. One is the project Rearc, as you're thinking of really re-understanding, okay, how can you, sort of not send all raw signals outside, but still be able to deliver value. And that's one side where you can have some more initiatives on that side. And it's not just a point of, okay, let's just put everything in there. No, it's a point of understanding what signals can and should be standardized. And then on the audience cohort side, I would say there's definitely value in terms of saying, okay, what can we standardize in terms of what value is there going to be from a demand side of the market that will be, that will make it easy from buying perspective. So I can definitely see value on that side.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. Garrett, what are your thoughts? I mean, obviously, if we have a competitive marketplace, based on server side Gatekeeper type approaches, having different signals for each of those gatekeepers might be problematic, right? Like, do you see a role for standardization in that regard, or any role for Tech Lab whatsoever to help kind of bolster this?
I think it's I mean, I think it's critically important that the entities like Tech Lab drive collaboration and drive standards. If we don't, and we'd love to say those words, but like seriously, if we do not collaborate as an industry, and we don't agree on standards, and we don't agree on governance policies, we're going to end up with one system that we're all subject to. So I think it's critically important that folks like the Tech Lab are involved in these conversations and help us get there.
Awesome. Yeah, couldn't agree more. We need Tech Lab is only as good as its component parts, right? The members of ours that actually contribute to these standards, and ultimately it's you guys, not only on this panel, but also listening in, who are really responsible for moving the needle. So thank you for kind of underscoring that, Garrett.
Yep.
So we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. Want to start taking some questions from the audience. Jordan, anything that you want to run by the group here that was submitted by?
Yeah, we're getting lots of questions. Real briefly, I've answered some questions already about the use of the need for standardized signals for audience taxonomy and content taxonomy, and I've answered some of the questions around that. Also, people have asked around, how do you make sure that it's defined the same way? So I've pointed folks to data transparency standards from us. So I've addressed that, but we've got a really good question from Alessandro Pereno, who asks, great question, from a consumer perspective, how do you see them understanding the differences from being part of a cohort versus being uniquely identifiable when they're seeing an ad that is relevant to something that they did before? How do we signal this more friendly value prop?
So why they ended up in a cohort versus some other ways they could be getting that ad? Is that
cohorts are more privacy, preserving, but if I still got, an ad from backcountry.com from the a jacket that I was looking at, then,
Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question. I might punt some of the analysts, but yeah, but like it gets to the heart of like the transparency portal concept, right? That a lot of browsers are thinking about, and trying to give consumers transparency in why they got the ad. I think that's going to be super important in the future. But yeah, why they got that ad because of something that they didn't necessarily kind of explicitly control, because it's an anonymized cohort itself, right? Could be an interesting way of interesting thing to think about as we start differentiating that versus they opted into this because they gave the New York Times permission, right? At the end of the day. So education, I think, is the answer to that, but I'll defer to you guys, Garrett and Abhishek and Ellie.
I mean, you could probably have an entire event about how to educate the consumers about what we do, how they can control it, how it's not intransparent or shouldn't be in the future. It's a really complicated question because they don't even understand really why they're being cookied today, or why that's good or why that's bad. And if they still get a clearly retargeted ad in the future, how is their privacy any more safe? But these transparency portals that you're talking about are an important topic, but being able to educate at scale on what we do is critical, but super complicated.
Yeah, and I think let's go to the next one, because I think it is all about communication and setting expectations with the user, which we all need to do a better job at. But we're getting voted up this one question: how do you manage consumer consent to use targeting when you have potentially thousands of SDKs? And I'd like this one towards Abhishek. When you have thousands of SDKs across disparate apps, how do you manage consent for a cohort-based approach?
Right. So from our point of view, we actually did not. So the way we see, that's how we believe any SDK should really operate. It is the host application's responsibility to manage, because the SDK is not in a position to request consent, because it is a third party, it is a data processor. The host application is going to be the data controller. So the host application is the one that props up, shows the pop-up for location, push notifications, Bluetooth permissions, etc. And any SDK that's sitting on the side, at least if it's going to be adding value or enriching the data from first party, it is processing that data. The consent management is a separate issue from enriching the data. Now, whatever, so for example, for us, I'll just say for us, for number 8, we can operate even without location permissions. So we'll have a limited subset of what we can offer. But then again, we are not in a position to say, all right, you have to give us location permissions, because that's just not what an advertising or any kind of personalization software should be doing. It's up to the user if the user, if he or she feels valued, I see a fair exchange of value in this experience, and then I'm willing to give my consent. So that's where I see that consent happening. So it doesn't have to be stored in some kind of server. It is actually localized on the device at that point. And that is a very fundamental difference in the approach, where you take a centralized approach, where you take a decentralized approach, where everything's happening on the device. But you're not having to deal with thousands of devices. You're dealing with one device, which is Jordan. Is Jordan going to give his location permissions? Maybe, I don't know. But if you do, you get this.
Yep. Yeah, it's an interesting question to navigate as we think about these addressability proposals moving forward. And ultimately, it's going to be something that we need kind of, consensus around. But I think that the only way we can do that is just, again, to underscore Garrett's point and Ellie's and also yours, Abhishek, you got to get involved. And if you are a Tech Lab member, please do participate in some of these VR conversations. With that, I think we're out of time. Thank you, Abhishek, Ellie, Garrett, good conversation. Yeah, I think more to come, I think, from the Tech Lab on the audience cohort front as we navigate these conversations, not only within REARC, but within some emerging pre-bid conversations as well. There's going to be a lot of interesting stuff on the horizon. So thanks again. I'm going to bring this deck back up and reintroduce our fearless leader, Dennis Buckheim, to present a series of service excellence awards that we do every year at our annual event. We're going to be doing these basically each of the 3 days. These award winners largely align with the topics that we talk about on each day, and reflects service to Tech Lab above and beyond the normal working group participation. With that, I'd love to get Dennis back up on board to go through this day's Service Excellence Awards.
And thanks again to all the panelists just now. Another great discussion. Really appreciate that. So as Ben mentioned, we're restarting the Tech Lab Service Excellence Awards, and this is really to recognize people without whom we literally, and yes, I mean the actual definition of literally, could not do what we do. So really excited to be able to recognize a handful of key people who've made just terrific contributions across several different working groups. So next slide, please. Thank you. So the first is Kevin Flood, who is receiving the award for his work on Content Taxonomy 2.x and Audience Taxonomy 1.x, and that's from the Taxonomy and Mapping Working Group. Thank you, Kevin. Next, please. Second is Andrea Gianangelo, award recipient for contributions to the data deletion request work in the CCPA Technical Working Group for California Consumer Privacy. Thank you. And then Chris Patterson, who has been just absolutely instrumental to the transparency and consent framework for GDPR, and specifically on the V2 JavaScript API work and device storage duration and access disclosure. Just a critical participant. Thank you, Chris. And last but not least is Dave Smith, award recipient for contributions to the Data Transparency Standard 1.0, which is kind of the core behind the data label that we've been ramping up over the past year. So thank you very much to all of the award winners and to everybody else who contributes every day in our working groups. You'll all be receiving an appropriately techie award, which is a mounted Raspberry Pi with your name engraved and everything on the plaque. So we'll share what that award looks like when we do the awards for tomorrow's session. So thank you all again. And I guess next up is turning consumers into authenticated users, featuring LiveRamp. So please tune back in for that, and we'll see you again shortly. Thank you again, everyone, and thank you again to our sponsors.